today to start with a little bit about the origin of this music and where we place it. Bach worked from around in the early 1710s, 12 in Weimar, where he was more busy as a violinist than anything else. And it's in that period of time that the scholars think that he began to work on the sonatas and partitas for solo Bach. And there were other people who were doing the sort of same thing at the same time for solo Bach, and I think he was intrigued by that. We don't know for sure when he wrote the cello suites, but after his period in Weimar, he went to a place called Köthen, where his boss, the prince, was more interested in instrumental music than in religious music. And of course, we know that in 1723, he went to Leipzig, where he stayed for the rest of his life, where his primary job was as a composer of religious music. And so a lot of this period from around 1715 to 1723 is a period in which we talk about the Brandenburg concertos, a lot of the keyboard solo pieces, pieces for organ, pieces that are instrumental and not cantatas and passions and things like that. I want to show you, just to begin, a facsimile of the title page that Bach wrote out in his own handwriting for this really wonderful, very, very clear manuscript of the sonatas and partitas for solo violin. So you'll see up here that it's violin without bass accompaniment. And this is the key thing that I want to focus on. It says libro primo. So the question is, well, if that's the first book, what's the second book? Guess what it is? It's the cello suites. Okay, and this actually then helps us date it all, because down here is his signature, Sir Johann Sebastian Bach, and it says anno, in English, 1720. So if he's referring to something called first book, it probably means that he'd already written the second book and all he copied was the first book, or the second book was coming out, going to be published soon, or something like that. But we can expect, therefore, that the cello suites arose in the same period of time as the violin suites and the violin sonatas and partitas. Now, the frustrating thing is that while, of course, there was a manuscript of the 6 suites, the one in his handwriting has been lost. And I would presume that it was lost sometime after his death, because we know that his son Carl Philipp Emanuel had it. And Carl Philipp Emanuel lived up until about 1760 or something like that. And then it's lost. So what we have instead as our principal source is a manuscript copied by his wife, Anna Magdalena Bach, his second wife, who was a soprano. And I can imagine that it happened something like this. The Bach family was very large. Bach had many children from the 2 wives. He had a very big job. And he always, so what else is new? He always needed money. And so I can imagine that what happened was that somebody came one day and said, I'd like to get a copy of your pieces for violin and cello. And he didn't have time to do that. And there were no Xerox machines and no iPhone cameras or anything like that. So this, by the way, I took yesterday with an iPhone camera. So, but I can imagine the conversation. It's my fantasy, is that he turns to his wife and he says, Anna, dear, somebody is going to pay us a nice sum of money for a copy of these pieces. Will you do that? And I can imagine she would have said, Hans, Johann, whatever she called him, you know, you're always having the rehearsals, there are all the kids to feed, and then there's all the things about the St. Thomas School with all of those young boys. And then when you have a rehearsal, it's always in the evening, and after that you want a whole table put out of wine and beer and food and everything like that. When am I possibly going to have time to do that? And he says, darling, he says, It's money. We need the money. So how can she refuse? So she makes a copy of it, and she made a copy of both of them. The copy of the violin ones exists also. And ever since then, that is the first source that we have for this music, and probably the most significant source, because clearly it was in the family and she copied it from her husband's manuscript. The issue comes up about not so much about the notes that are in there, but about the articulations, the bowings. And this is an argument that will never be over. But we're going to get into that a little bit just today by looking at some of her manuscript and talking about some possibilities, because there's no certainties. And if you read my blog, you'll talk about the one manuscript we have of any of this that is in his own handwriting, which is he made a transcription for lute of the Fifth Suite. And that is a magnificent manuscript, and you can read more about it on CelloBello.